Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar this evening on Necrocapitalism and Psychic Violence. Just to introduce the series of which this webinar forms a part. It's the second webinar in the 2022 PsySSA webinar series entitled Facing the Future with Psychology, Perspectives, Praxis, and People, which is hosted by the PsySSA presidency, but this particular webinar is co-hosted with PsySSA and the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. So introduced in 2021, each year the series theme aims to extend and contribute to discussions that are at the cutting edge of psychology, foregrounding developments within the discipline, science, and profession of psychology, as well as grappling with the implications thereof for practice, scholarship, training, public and policy engagement, collaboration and solidarities, activism, and advocacy. The 2021 series was successful in moving these engagements beyond the borders that tend to circumscribe the scope, reach, and reception of psychology. And it's expected that the 2022 series, which is a 4-webinar contribution, will do the same. The webinars are free, open to all, and they are also CPD accredited for those that need the continuous professional development points. You get 2 general CPD points for each webinar that you attend. If you do need these points, please complete the CPD evaluation form that'll be shared in the chat in the last 15 or 20 minutes of the webinar, and then you'll receive your CPD certificate. A recording of this webinar will also be made available on the PsySSA YouTube channel. Before we get started though, I'd just like to invite us to observe a moment of silence in memory of Shireen Abu Akleh, who was assassinated yesterday by settler forces in Jenin, Palestine. In remembering her, we remember the many others who have tragically and unacceptably been murdered by colonial violence throughout the world. Thank you very much. Okay, so my name is Nick. I'm going to facilitate this event. I work at the UNISA's Institute for Social and Health Sciences, and I'm a co-editor with Shanaz Safla of the journal Social and Health Sciences. Shanaz Safla is also the president of PsySSA. I'm very excited to hear all of these different talks this evening, and I think hearing them all together is going to be quite a useful way for understanding the enormity and the scope of the topic at hand. But before I introduce the different speakers, I just want to give a bit of context to this particular webinar. Psychic Violence and Necrocapitalism and Psychic Violence was the title of a special issue that was hosted in Social and Health Sciences, and that was guest edited by Lara Sheehi, who's one of our speakers this evening. And so for those of you who don't know, Social and Health Sciences is now in its 21st year of publication, but for 18 of those years, it was known as African Safety Promotion, a journal of injury and violence prevention. This name change was an attempt to kind of renew the scope of the journal and ensure that it could speak to today's most pressing socio-political concerns, especially the ever-deepening social and economic inequalities that have come to mark our present conjuncture, as well as the evolving intersections of these inequalities with health, safety, and peace in, but also beyond the global south. So although the journal is located in South Africa, it's internationalist in its scope, and it hopes to embody a multidisciplinary forum for critical discussion and debate among scholars, practitioners, activists, students, and policymakers. This special issue on necrocapitalism that Lara curated, and I must say curated with such warmth, rigor, and integrity, spoke to the renewed scope of the journal perfectly. And so we felt very privileged to host it. And each of today's speakers have an article in that special journal that they're going to be speaking to in some way or another. We're going to paste the full list of the authors that featured in the special issue along with their bios and the article titles in the chat, and we'll also post a link to the special issue for anyone that's interested. But I'm also just going to mention their names and the article titles here quickly, just to pay tribute to what I think is a really, really excellent and really, really important and timeless and urgent special issue. So Lara Sheehi, speaking this evening, wrote the introduction to the special issue. Oh, they'll also feature there in some of the slides, I think. Nadira Shalom Kevorkian and Stephanie Wahab wrote an article, both of whom are also speaking this evening, for the special issue entitled Colonial Necrocapitalism, State Secrecy and the Palestinian Freedom Tunnel. Shia Young wrote a piece entitled Home, Dark, Blue. Zoe Samudzi is also speaking this evening. Her piece was entitled Looting the Archive, German Genocide and Incarcerated Skulls. Assad Ashim Sharma, who is also speaking this evening, a piece in the special issue entitled Stepping to the Left of Ontology. Moira Ozias and Z Nicolazo's piece was entitled She, Her, Hers, Pronouns, Possession, and White Woman's Consumption of Gender. Farouk Taylor had the Disauto-Ethnographist Oriki. Stephen Sheehi had the piece Al-Nizam, Lebanon as a Necrocapitalist State. And Farara Sani and Jelaine Kinowani had the last piece in the issue titled Migration, Homelessness, and Internalized Displacement. And so what I found to be so useful analytically about this, the concept of necrocapitalism that cuts across all of these articles, is that although capitalism is often qualified with different prefixes and signifiers, late stage capitalism, developed capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, etc. Necrocapitalism makes it very clear that we're dealing with a global political economy that is premised on death, and particularly the deaths of the most marginalized populations in the global south. Necrocapitalism, I think, makes it clear that capitalism is utterly reliant on colonial matrices of power and imperial methods of extraction, environmental destruction, and psychic degradation. And so it's with the concept of necrocapitalism, I think, that we can see how Marx's idea of original accumulation or the exploitation of colonies as the original sin of capitalism is far from over. Death is and has always been central to the global movement of capital. And this sadly rang true once again yesterday with the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. And so, as I said in the beginning, I think it's what's so useful and enriching is to listen to these speakers together as we're able to tonight, because it helps us to make sense not only of the sheer expanse and scope of necrocapitalism, but also its effects and the different avenues for resistance to necrocapitalism and what such resistance might mean from an internationalist standpoint. Okay, so I've spoken for a little bit long now, I think, so we're going to move on to the speakers who I'm going to introduce in turn, after which Professor Garth Stevens will respond to the speakers, and then we will take questions after that. So the first speaker was the guest editor of the special issue was Lara Sheehi, who is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the George Washington University's professional psychology program. She teaches decolonial, liberatory, and anti-oppressive theories and approaches to clinical treatment, case conceptualization, and community consultation. She's the president-elect for the Society of Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology. She's the co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and also a co-editor of Counterspace in Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society. She's on the advisory board to the USA Palestine Mental Health Network and Psychoanalysis for Pride. She's the co-author with Stephen Sheehi of the book, the really, really excellent book, Psychoanalysis and Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which was published by Routledge earlier this year. Thanks, Lara.
I can't start my video without, I think Fatima has to let me do that.
Is it not letting you share your screen?
It's not letting me turn on my video. There we go. The host did that. Okay, thank you. Here we are. Thank you so much, Nick. I so appreciate it. We'll أهلا وسهلا بالكل. أنا اسمي لارا شيحة، وخصوصي اللي عم بيتابعونا من فلسطين المحتلة. أنا قلبي دايما معكم أكيد، بس خصوصي اليوم بفلسطين، بجنين، بغزة، بالقدس وبرام الله. شكرا إذا أنتم معنا، وعرفوا أنه نحن كلنا معكم صامدين. I'd also like to start with a land acknowledgement, which for me is important as a means of reclaiming disavowals. And certainly I want to note that when we talk about land acknowledgements, that under settler colonial violence and necrocapitalism, this is only a starting point, it's not an end point. And so when I speak about land acknowledgements, I'm also speaking into the necessity for land back. I'm currently speaking to you from the stolen land of the Nakachenk and Piscataway people. And with that, I'd also like to note all political prisoners in this settler colony and in settler colonies across the world, including our sibling George Abdullah and those who are incarcerated in the United States carceral machine. As Nick mentioned, today's talk feels especially important as we watch the settler colonial violence enacted on our Palestinian siblings by the apartheid state now known as Israel. Yesterday, not only was an entire building demolished in Silwan, but also, as we all saw, and as the moment of silence marked, our beloved journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was assassinated by an IOF sniper in her press gear. This is precisely what psychic violence is. Intruding on the province of what is deemed to be sacred, what is widely seen as protected space and place, what should grant you immunity. And yet what we see over and again, there's a collapse of that space when Palestinians are involved. A targeted assassination, a commitment to snuff out life, a concerted effort to vacate even interior safety. And yet here we are in defiance today. A painful defiance, yes, but one that refuses but to live and flourish in solidarity, in struggle, in community, as we're doing here today, and as Nadira has personally taught me. A special thank you to Nick and Ashley, who shepherded this special issue through, and also, of course, as always, a thank you to Shahnaz, Muhammad, Fatima, and Garth, the Institute and the Society, for bringing us together and for having this idea, which not coincidentally came into being after Nadira Shalhoub Kavrokyan was attacked by right-wing Zionists who called for her firing after our special issue was published, focusing on her and Stephanie's truth-telling about state secrecy. So we all woke up to a publication that blasted Nadira and Stephanie's piece and specifically targeted Nadira. Turns out that necrocapitalist states don't like being outed. As always, our comrades in South Africa rallied, and we all came together to speak louder into and against this violence. If violence is at our feet against our will as people of the global South, let us set the frame, the narrative. Let's refuse the settler colonial logics that necrocapitalism shores up. This special issue is another testament to that world building, imagining the world we want to see and living it out in ways that align with our life-making efforts. To that end, I cannot extend my gratitude enough to Nadira, Stephanie, Hannah, Azad, Zoe, Moira, Z, Fuluke, Istfin, Furaha, and Gilan, all of whom brought their revolutionary fire, their exquisite truth-telling and witnessing, and more importantly, their world-making commitment into a space with me, entrusting me with that in the face of fascism and the potential for further psychic intrusion. In this way, we together across time and space engaged in collective imagining, speaking into the world not only the truths of psychic violence as fascism is upon us in the now, but also, more importantly, speaking life and possibilities beyond the foreclosures that necrocapitalist violence insists on. I hope it's clear that this special is really near and dear to my heart. Every person I reached out to to join me in this special edition provides a contour of a radical relationship that has emerged in collaboration, scholarly, socially, but always politically. This issue is ours in every sense of the word, an intervention that mobilizes and platforms a decolonial global synergy as a counterforce against necrocapitalist violence and its resultant and sustained psychic intrusions. I'm loving the comments. And so a word on why necrocapitalism and why psychic violence, which is the theme of this special issue. And a part of that comes from my own story of how I came to be interested in this concept. After the blast that rocked Beirut, Lebanon on August 4th, 2020, we were simultaneously watching virulent and blatant spectacles of fascism with a global connectivity and networks that illuminated a deeply entrenched logic of white supremacy, whether it's from the settler colony now known as the United States, to the settler colony now known as Canada, to the settler colony now known as Israel, to India, to Hungary, to Brazil, to the United Kingdom, and onwards. The depth and breadth and seeming arbitrariness of the violence in Beirut intensified the suspicion of my own grief, mobilizing my longstanding clinical interests in the pervasive psychic elements of social, economic, and psychic structures that naturalize systems of large-scale violence that we're seeing play out on the global scale every day. I started to think about psychic intrusions as perhaps the organizing weaponry of necrocapitalism, providing it with a relational and psychic realm mediated by death and dying in its multiple dimensions, forms, and processes as a primary function of its all-consumptive oppression. To me, it felt like necrocapitalism, beyond Membe's necropolitics, further capitalizes on the dead themselves, positioning asphyxiatory and murderous practices as a predicate of life for some, a some whose contours are determined, shored up, and sustained by and through the dying. This is something that every one of our contributors took up with such breathtaking precision. What was the texture, the tinge of something else that alerted me to a psychic, unspoken known, something we all felt? This special issue was an attempt to answer those questions, not individually, but rather in community, a global community of solidarity in our struggles. With the centrifugal force of violence emanating in this particular sociopolitical moment, the contributions did so much. They moved beyond the necropolitical, pushing past only articulating the ways in which governing state and corporate regimes manage the social, psychic, and embodied life and death of bodies under their sovereignty. Instead, each contribution attended to a specific iteration of the psychic violence enacted by necrocapitalism, as well as movingly living and breathing presence in defiance of death. In this way, this issue emerges as speaking of, to, and through various forms of dispossession, not as byproducts, but as constitutive of the very mechanics of necrocapitalist accumulation. Put simply, this issue speaks truth to the incommensurability of necrocapitalist violence and what Nandita calls livability, or what Banerjee, who is the first person to use necrocapitalism, notes as, quote, a power to decide the value of life, which would allow a life to be killed without the charge of homicide, end quote. It feels really chilling to hear that against the backdrop of the assassination of Shireen yesterday. Movingly, each contribution in this special issue highlights how the logics of necrocapitalism does not exist in psychic displacement alone, but rather pulsates in the material realities of those present, past, and future who suffer under its violence. In this way, discrete and localized structures of necrocapitalism create a global matrix of violent possibilities exacted through psychic intrusion, physical dispossession, and the exploitation of death states in gendered, raced, classed, and indigenized realms. These contributions are bold, politically radical, moving, and personal. Each long piece is interspersed with a poetic piece, an in vivo materialization of psychic undoing, a holding of communal space, and a reclaiming of art as a necessary mode to bust necrocapitalist violence and psychic intrusion. Before I end, I want to say that what I believe distinguishes this special issue is a particular type of suspension of end product, a decolonial turn to possibilities that are made and remade, done and undone through the very process of working through. The issue relies on the power not only to witness, alongside siblings, the psychic violence wrought by necrocapitalism, but also, and most importantly to me, and what buoys me, is the life-making practices that are essential in warding off its intrusion. I'm excited for you to hear it for yourself in each of these beautiful pieces, in our wonderful speakers today, and to be here in community with us all. Amandla.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Lara. That was really beautifully put, and I think sets the stage quite nice for the other speakers. We're going to move on now. People are welcome to ask questions in the Q&A throughout, and we'll collect those and address them at the end. The next speaker we have is Zoe Samudzi, who holds a PhD in medical sociology from the University of California, San Francisco, and is a research associate at the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. She's a writer, an art critic, and an associate editor at Parapraxis magazine.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here. And I'm really grateful for Lara for assembling all of us into this incredible issue. I'm just going to share a little bit of the kind of framing politics of my piece and then read a little bit from the end of it. My piece talks about, in writing about the Ovaherero and Nama genocide by the Imperial Germany from 1904 to 1908, my piece is about the afterlife of genocide, which kind of rejects this bounded 4-year period of genocidal violence and attempts a narrative of ongoingness that troubles this colonial ordering of time by recognizing the resonances of events that are registered as bounded, and to recognize these events across time and through a multiplicity of temporalities, namely the space-time considerations, materialities, and metaphysics of the affected communities, as well as the enduring notions of indigenous personhoods that are being articulated by those communities and by others. And the question that's posed by this formulation of genocide is not simply the question of whether or not a genocide occurred, but rather, as the German government is kind of presently grappling with in its various offers of financial settlements, and as it figures out how to superficially recognize without being compelled to pay reparations. But the utility of afterlife is in its ability to allow for spatialization of racecraft and of race making, to understand how the attempted extermination of Ovaherero and Nama people is rearticulated and rematerialized in the present, not only in Namibia and in Germany, but also in the transnational carceral geographies of the museums rather, and other institutional holdings of the ancestral remains of Ovaherero and Nama and countless other indigenous communities around the world. The framing also, and I think most importantly, permits me as a Zimbabwean living in the settler United States to theorize violence and restitution through my own political, social, cultural grammar, through the responsibility of Hunu, also known as Ubuntu, which complements the conceptions of life, death, and ancestral responsibility of Ovaherero and Nama people in Namibia and throughout the diaspora. It refuses the colonial attempts at epistemicide, the denial of indigenous and other racialized communities to advance our worldviews and nurture our kinships across borders. And before I start reading, I always ground myself in the words and the writings of Panashe Chigumadzi to orient myself in these values rather than those of the Euro-colonial human as man, from which we as Black people are always precluded. And in her book, Panashe writes about this kind of orientation in the Shona context, where she says, you know, if one wants to ask if another person is a person, they might ask the question, and my Shona is very bad because I grew up in the United States. They might ask the question, munuhere, or is this a human being? And one might answer no or yes, depending on that person's conduct, because one's personhood is dependent upon their relation to others. One might also ask the question, Kwaita kwe munuhere, or is this how humans behave? Either in reprimanding a child for bad behavior or in addressing a particular group of people regarding their historical treatment of Black African people. And in response to that foundational question, munuhere, one might respond, Iowa, murungu, or no, they're a white person because of their historical mistreatment of indigenous people. But otherwise, white settlers have not been considered Vanu, people, because of their historic failure to treat the indigenous people with hunu, humanity. So from there, I'll just read a little bit from my piece. The 1990 passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in the United States has led to the repatriation of multiple sets of human remains from the American Museum of Natural History to their respective indigenous communities domestically, and notably has changed the ways that museums and other scientific educational institutions engage indigenous remains in their collections. The legislation created, quote, regulations to develop a systematic process for determining the rights of lineal descendants and Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations to certain Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and other objects of cultural patrimony to which domestic museums are bound. But because there is no formalized analogous protocol in international law, non-American indigenous communities are forced to appeal for restitution through other avenues. While the German government previously acknowledged the genocide via the Minister of Development's public apology on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Waterberg, her apology was dismissed by the German government as a personal statement not indicative of any changes in stance or policy. Germany has continuously ruled out formal compensation or financial restitution for Ovaherero and Nama communities, instead preferring to engage its culpability for genocide through bilateral relations with the Namibian nation state in exclusion of survivor groups, Namibian state in turn fears Ovaherero and Nama demands will undermine the German-Namibian relationship, although German representatives have insulted. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna close the window real quick because they started mowing the lawn right outside. I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. The German government has been clear that the repatriation of skulls should not be used as a part of a larger effort to engage imperial atrocities committed against Namibian people. If the skulls were used as a driver for comprehensive reparations, it might compromise the good standing Namibia has enjoyed as a recipient of German aid and financial support. This is a sentiment that has been both evoked by German and Namibian politicians alike. Despite such declarations from both parties, this does not reflect the multiplicity of ideas and feelings held by the leadership of and members within Ovaherero and Nama communities. Both through the non-apology acknowledgements of the German state and the continued incarceration of Ovaherero and Nama remains in American Museum archives, we can come to understand human remains as technologies upon which not only the names of eugenicists, but also global political agendas are inscribed. Post-independence politics do not give meaning to these skeletal remains. The bones themselves serve as rallying points for collective cultural expressions of mourning, celebration, remembrance, and demands for restitution. The materiality of human remains deserve analysis as a phenomenon in itself, especially as they have become a material representation of German dispossession and the racial structures of property and ownership that have retained their disciplinary power in organizing territory and producing racial subjects through a hierarchy of value. Central to this necropolitical capture is the nation state. The post-colonial African state is not exempted from its active role in indigenous dispossession. Ahead of the 2011 repatriation of skulls from the Charité collection in Berlin, Namibian politicians selected Heroes Acre, a site of burial for Namibian national heroes, as the final resting place for Ovaherero and Nama bones. This cabinet decision followed a previous meeting with members of the Herero Council, who decided that the skulls should, quote, become part of the property of the Namibian government so that they can be kept in a professional way and keep the memory of this part of Namibian history alive for future generations. Ovaherero Paramount Chief Kwaima Riruako and Nama Chief David Frederick expressed concern about this unilateral decision announced by the Namibian government. They felt that if the memory of the genocide is to be kept alive, then the skulls should be kept in a special chamber in the Independence Memorial Museum, rather than burying them in a plot that cannot easily be seen. The German-Namibian insistence on bilateralism is another manifestation of the national impulse to undermine indigenous sovereignty. The Heroes Acre is a spatial tool of national memory making. Individuals sacralized as heroes are assimilated into the state's historical canon, created and mobilized to maintain a national unity. National identity, as with many nation states, is especially fraught in the case of post-independence Namibia. The ruling party, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, is the party of the independence movement, as well as the successor to the Ovambo Land People's Organization, and is dominated by Ovambo people, Namibia's numerical majority. Suggested internment at the Heroes Acre is ironically a capitulatory gesture that lends itself to the further erasure of the Ovaherero and Nama genocide from national memory. The memorial is far removed from public life in the capital. Heroes Acre is several kilometers outside of Windhoek, whereas the Independence Museum is on a main road in the capital near the city center. Within the Independence Museum, the affected communities have also been excised from national memory. The museum's curation elides the relationship between the genocide and the national story, collapsing the brutality of German imperialism into decontextualized and unexplained exhibitions about harmonious pre-colonial existences amongst Namibian tribes and the scramble for Africa's disruption of indigenous life. While mentioned in the section detailing pre-colonial life, the Ovaherero and Nama and San ceased to exist again in the present. Most of the museum is instead dedicated to the liberation history of SWAPO, the primary drivers of both the founding of the independent state and the terms of present negotiation. German recognition has been fraught and piecemeal, but in May 2021, the government finally offered to acknowledge the suffering of the Ovaherero and Nama as genocide, despite denying genocidal responsibility in the now dismissed class action lawsuit. After a previously rejected settlement offer for 10 million euros in August 2020, the German government has now announced it would disperse 1.1 billion euro to infrastructural efforts and existing aid programs over 30 years, approximately the sum of development aid per annum given to Namibia since independence. Further, 50 million euro would go towards the institutionalization of reconciliation between the two states. The exclusion of Ovaherero and Nama members, community members from the negotiations constitutes, paradoxically, their forcible assimilation into the state. The functional move from the already truncated Ovaherero and Nama genocide to the Namibian genocide and the Namibian state's ability to accept recognition, apology, and steward compensatory funds on behalf of affected communities has been received by Ovaherero and Nama leadership as an insult. Germany has been emphatic that this money is not reparations, but for Ovaherero and Nama people, the agreement is perceived as having little to do with them because they have been systematically excluded. Since independence, the communities have been fashioned as ritual sacrificial imperial objects that have been pushed to liminality and dispossessed of their sovereign autonomy, forms of personhood, and of their land, first by Imperial Germany, then by South African apartheid, and now by the Namibian state. It is this simultaneous material indigenous disenfranchisement and biologization of citizenship that defines Westphalian statecrafting, even in post-colonial Africa. An August 2021 event for the Rautenstrasse Joost Museum's Resist the Art of Resistance exhibition, a panel of Ovaherero and Nama activists spoke about genocide memory and the political implications of German acknowledgement. They reiterated the illegitimacy of the bilateral agreement, acknowledgement and reconciliation, And on German recognition, one panelist said, quote, "Acknowledgement is not just Germany saying they acknowledge. What are they acknowledging? What does Germany acknowledge as genocide? And what would Germans say their government is apologizing for?" Following Sam Geiseb's comment, Howie Richavia Taylor and Dirk Moses asked, quote, "If reparations are to any degree monetary, then how does German officialdom engage with the question of to whom a debt is to be owed, and how is that debt understood and articulated, if at all?" Geiseb expanded the bounds of apology beyond the perverse calculations of capitalist recompense and into the needs to redress current landlessness and dispossession by the Namibian state and the descendants of German settlers. While there is, of course, a call for financial restitution, Indigenous conception of apology is a far-reaching and restorative justice-driven recognition of the Germans' afterlife beyond the purview of nation-state bilateralism and exculpatory German apology in the name of reconciliation. They're articulating recognition as a grammar of futurity that demands an ontological shift and an ontological correction that encompasses the ongoing incarceration of human remains and other material objects, land enclosure, and the theft of ancestral territories, and the diaspora created by genocide. On the very first page of The Invention of Africa, V.Y. Mudimbe writes that, quote, "Colonialism and colonization basically mean organization, arrangement." This etymological reminder compels the practice of decolonization as an epistemological reorganization, a reparative looting of the colonial archive via the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zoe. I think that gives people a nice feeling for that for Zoe's piece, which was really moving and powerful. I've written in the chat. I've posted a PDF document with the details of the different articles, as well as a link to the special issue, and I've also pasted my email address there for anyone that wants access to any of the articles. Please feel free to email me and I will send them to you. Okay, so next up we have Stephanie Wahab and Nadira Shalok-Kevorkian. Just to give a bio of the two of the speakers they co-published an article together in the special issue. Stephanie is a professor at the Portland State University School of Social Work and honorary research associate professor at the University of Otago, Social and Community Work in New Zealand. She teaches courses focused on social justice, philosophies of science, qualitative inquiry, and intimate partner violence. Her research and scholarship tend to focus on issues of violence, including but not limited to intimate partner violence, institutional and state-sanctioned violence, and occupation. She's the co-editor of Feminisms in Social Work, Promise and Possibilities for Justice-Based Knowledge. Nadira is the Lawrence D. Beale Chair in Law at the Faculty of Law, Institute of Criminology and School of Social Work and Public Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Global Chair in Law, Queen Mary, University of London. Her research focuses on trauma, state crimes and criminology, surveillance, gender, violence, law, and society. She studies the crime of femicide and other forms of gender-based violence, violence against children in conflict-ridden areas, crimes of abuse of power in settler colonial contexts, surveillance, securitization, and social control. She's the author and the co-author of many books and many articles, and she's a prominent activist and engages in direct actions and critical dialogue to end the inscription of power over Palestinian children's lives, spaces of death, and women's birthing bodies and lives. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Zoe so much. Shukran, Laura, and Nick, and everybody who was responsible for this special issue. It's an honor to learn from all of you, as well as to be able to think with everybody today. I am speaking from the unceded territories of the Multnomah, the Clackamas, Cathlamet, Tumwater, the Watala bands of the Chinook in the northwest region of Turtle Island. So Nadra and I wrote a paper about the ways that the Israeli security apparatus functions as a technology of settler colonial violence, its intent on destroying and erasing Palestinian people, psyches, families, communities, and culture. We had planned to speak a little bit more about the paper and what we wrote, and we changed our plans late last night due to the events of the last 48 hours in Jenin, occupied East Jerusalem, and Silwan, as they require attention and they offer real-time examples of the varied faces of necrocapitalism. So the plan is I'm going to offer a few words, just a couple of minutes about some of the main ideas that we have highlighted in our paper. And then I will cede the rest of my time to my dear friend and colleague Nadra, who will speak to the suffocating necro-capital violence that is happening in real time. So the first thing to understand is that the Israeli security forces use secrecy and threats of secret information, even if that information, that secret information, is made up, about and against individual Palestinians as a tool of control and violence. We, in our writing, have leaned on a concept of swarming. Think of bees and the ways that they swarm, to understand the intricate web of secrecy and control and entrapment. So the settler colonial state coordinates across various ministries and entities to wage secret wars that it reduces to economic, health, legal, and intellectual attacks. All this, of course, while claiming to be a liberal democracy. So while this is not a secret to Palestinians, the state uses its secrecy apparatus to keep Palestinians in a maze of bureaucracies that are inside an affective state of fear and anxiety. What we have termed previously as affective colonization, and what Jeronen and Griffiths refer to as affective demolitions. Nadra, in her research, spoke to a woman, to give you just a minuscule example, who was threatened by the Israeli forces that they would disclose to her husband that she had previously had an abortion that she had not shared with him. And they threatened her with this secret, saying that they would reveal the secret to her husband if she did not share information about her neighbor and her neighbor's brother. So within a necro-capital framework, the very existence of Palestinians endanger the colonial state, and it follows that their death is necessary for the survival of the Israeli. Banerjee defines necrocapitalism as contemporary forms of organizational accumulation that involve dispossession and the subjugation of life to the power of death. So necrocapitalism, operationalized through violent policing of Palestinians, as we see happening right now, the assassination of Shireen, the torture through solitary confinement of youth and children, goes beyond the subjugation of life to the power of death by extending necro power as a means of accumulating and profiting from the death of Palestinians. This is what David Harvey defines as accumulation by dispossession. So although the accumulated dispossession of Palestinians is not only from the living, their land, life, and death, but also from their psyches. Thus, necrocapitalism and its exclusionary politics are central to understanding a secrecy as security, whereby profit flows from visible and invisible violence, as well as the killing of the colonized, as a state of fear generates continuous insecurity, which in turn generates a demand for security goods within global capitalism. So Nadra has proposed elsewhere that Israel is one of the top arms exporters in the world. Others have as well. So with the United States' consistent and inordinate financial allocation to Israel's military, the latter leads the world in border technology, military occupation, and population control. The territories that Israel occupies are used not only to settle Jewish foreigners, but also to turn land into showrooms of weaponry, technologies and methods of domination and control. So Israel commodifies its security and secrecy practices within global capitalism, and then promotes them as goods to be sold to other regimes to be used on other oppressed populations. Israel's economy is thus heavily dependent upon and continuously sustained by capitalizing on the subjugation and death of Palestinians. Following the argument that Israel's economy depends on the political and economic capital accumulated through its secrecy apparatus to control and erase us, the settler state reconstructs spaces like occupied East Jerusalem and Gaza as spaces of death for Palestinians where harassment, threats, interrogation, and even possible execution loom amidst everyday activities. So the domination of every inch of space that the settler state can lay its hands on aims to sustain the military industrial maker. So now I will hand it over to Nadra, who can speak to real-time impacts of necrocapitalism.
Thank you, Stephanie. شكرا كتير. ومساء الخير للجميع. شكرا لارا على الدعوة وستيفاني على التفاكر المشترك. شكرا كتير. Well, we decided that I will take the element of necrocapitalism and show it through the latest example, the last 24 hours. And I'm speaking to you from the occupied East Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem, where the industry of death and murderous killing is affecting us all. And to talk more about how the death and murderous killing of Shireen, the demolition of homes, the eviction of people, the incarceration of Ahmed Manasra, keeping him the last 7 months in solitary confinement, are all part of the showrooms. The bodies, the life, the spaces, the time, the flesh is part of this necropolitics. But I want to take you to Shada. Shada was the last very young journalist that was with Shireen Abu Aqli when she was executed. And she kept on saying, كنا نبكي ونصور منصور جرائم الاحتلال ونبكي. So she was crying, but she was documenting the atrocities of the occupation, but continuing to document. So for now, as the young journalist that witnessed the killing of Shireen told us all, I cry, and it's hard, but document, record, videotape, and cry, and document their atrocities. So Palestine is mourning today. The everydayness of the unending condition and the ongoing atrocities are hard, and I'm mourning. The settler colonial violence really treats the psychic, our psychic, as active war zones, as a space of psychological warfare geared to impair the colonized and colonize them effectively, as Stephanie was explaining. So the ways this unending uprooting, dispossession, carcerality, and psychic violence functions in the service of the settler state, necro-capitalist hunger, and its need for accumulation is always hard at work. But we are mourning our beloved ones today, and the precious souls like Shireen, like the homes, like the children executed. And this morning, with this heavy day, the painful and agonizing, we walked the street of Jerusalem with her coffin that have arrived, and the slogans that came to the French hospital that were chanted were ارفع صوتك وعلي الموت ولا المذلة. ارفع صوتك وعلي الموت ولا المذلة. Raise your voice, raise your hand, ارفع ايدك وعلي. Elevate yourself. Death is better than living without dignity. So how can one silence such strong voice of right to life, to livability, to home and homeland? So yesterday when Shireen's body was brought to Al Jazeera's office in Ramallah, someone asked, but where are her relatives? وين أهلها? Where's her family? How come they're not here? And my friend Amal responded assertively, we are her أهلها, we are her family. We are كل فلسطين أهلها, all Palestine is her family. This is how resistance to necrocapitalism work in Palestine in such an embodied and spatialized struggle. This is how we go. So let me remind us all, the crimes started before the shooting of Shireen, yeah? Way before the shooting. And all of a sudden, suspicions, this is what we hear. The New York Times, in one of its headlines, said Shireen died at the age of 51. Yani we Palestinians die. Palestinians die, they're not killed, or live suffocated, under siege, wounded, as homeless, in tents, in incarcerated apartheid Bantustans, in solitary confinement, because this is what they want. And coloniality is dependent on knowing, on knowers, on knowledge. For those who colonized Palestine, established themselves as those who had access to truth, and the colonized as those who did not. So in states terrorism and murderous killing, what we hear all the time is denial, immorality, repression. And denial, as you all know, is political. And the political is very psychological and affective. When we expose the play between the knowing, knower, and knowledge, we expose the relation of power and the demand to subordinate to that empirical, legal, or even today with the situation of shooting Shireen to death, the ballistic analysis, and bringing with it what Sheila Sandoval calls the drive to final mastery, because they are the only ones that can master the knowledge on the ballistic analysis to fortify expansionist necrocapitalism to the globe, So for us to know is to capture, to own, to control people, land, evidence, truth, to produce new one. So knowledge, disregard, exterminate, and this is what they're doing when they know ballistic knowledge, They thingify, destroy intellectual and cultural contributions of the colonized, creating an enslavement to the colonizers' imagination, their ideology. This is why she died at the age of 51. She was not shot, although she was clearly shot, turning it into a capital, into a science. And I will come back to this concept because this is what we talk in our article. And the world is suspicious, calling for the need to investigate, uncertainty, denial, states denial, all the above are sites of reflection for us, of pondering, of rumination, those psychopolitical scenes of brutality. The productions provide a gaze into the necrocapitalist dispossession, even of the right to narrate. This bloodthirst mentality that is controlled by brutality is camouflaged with scientifically proven evidence that is later sold as combat proven. So living and dying on and in ruins, when and while wounded, living in the ruins of our home, when, as a student of mine just informed me, some headlines, Israeli and US are producing new narrations. Shireen, like many Palestinian female terrorists, put themselves in a condition to be killed. Wow. So not killed, executed, but suicidal female, Or as Yuad just wrote on her Facebook a couple of minutes ago, that an Israeli radio was interviewing an Israeli scholar, and he said, no worry, the world will forget, not even dogs will remember the dead Palestinians to that degree. So today, the ongoing settler colonial violence, the necropolitics are creating ruins as privileged sites of reflection, psychic and material structures beyond repair and in deterioration. Much like Fanon wrote about the psychological and material decay that follows colonialism, our present wounding, the loss, speak to effectual colonization of the self resulting from necrocapitalism, that yearns and the hunger to consume and assemble all sorts of things, as we see today in the different sites where Shireen's body is planned to be buried tomorrow, here close to my house. So the mourners in Palestine lend support to Fanon's analysis that psychic distress can destroy people's bodies and distort their minds. That's why when Stephanie was talking to me yesterday, it was hard for me to agree to speak today. But that creation of ruins is also where we insist on considering the role of Palestinians' refusal, Palestinian sumud, and Palestinian hope. So to stay in that space of loss, to understand it, to absorb it, in order to survive it, is crucial. Loss is about psychological demoralization and annihilation, and socioeconomic control. Uprooting and loss became a dominant trope, very dominant trope in settler colonial politics, a firm erasure of the humanity of the colonized. Its focus is necrocapitalist. It is the killing of the colonized, rooted in the logic of elimination. So think about the bodies as states' brutal, theatric spaces, modes of accumulation, because Palestinian bodies, Palestinian spaces, including spaces of death, spaces of life, are threatened because they're threatening the sacredness and exclusivity of the state. So the state invades Shireen's house in Beit Hanina to restrict the display of the Palestinian flag. Her flesh, her body, and the killing of her body continues with the overkilling, yeah? And that overkilling is important because it's restricting the use of the flag, it's restricting the crossings of her beloved ones to come and pay their farewell. In addition to this, the epistemic violence, as Zoe was talking about, as another mode of accumulation. And we need ethnographies, we need studies, we need analysis that frames and centers the colonized narration, producing a kind of narrative repair, a homegrown ethnography, a homegrown right to narrate that creates a point of repair. And the psychological warfare, in addition to the hidden modes of war that we have exposed in our article. So we looked closely at secrecy as a great necrocapitalist politics. It needs no such justification for its existence, since it is always and forever regarded as state necessity, mainly since the enemy, Palestinian, is still alive. It can't continue because the enemy is really still alive, and therefore the need to kill. The challenge is political, and the challenge is analytical. We must recognize how the wounding effects of secrecy, its duration, moments of exposure, brutality, further ruins the colonized mind and life. And it is from those same ruins and against necrocapitalist brutality that the freedom tunnel are unlocked and carcerality is uprooted. So how are the various modalities of necrocapitalism are mobilizing? Look at US funding, $3.2 million to the apartheid government, and this should stop. This is a US funded settler colonial regime that is embedded in a global political culture of impunity. So talking about investigation of conduct of war crime, but Israel will never agree. So we could never do that. It is a deadlock. All investigations look at what happened in Gaza 2014, the Mavi Marmara, the flotilla, no matter how many investigations, you can't ask murderers to conduct an investigation. So the argument that Israel is fully capable of investigating itself, as in the case of Shireen now, the playbook is to distract, using their secret, securitized, ballistic knowledge, and hence the need to call it off. Secret evidence to detain journalists, and the Israeli targeted journalists made journalism only be, only against Zionists is a crime, not against Russia, not against Ukraine. Maybe pain, trauma, loss, and wounding belongs only to Zionists, and Palestinians can be maimed, debilitated, and slowly erased with securitized theologies and legalized manipulation and secret manipulation. Our decolonial writing and production of knowledge should contest the circulation of brutality and its mental poison as scientific as Israeli rationales and psychology and mental health included. And hence the importance of thinking against the epistemological crisis that is nourishing this necrocapitalism. To end, what I ask myself, what is this rage against Palestinian and against Palestine? The accumulative brutality, the will to destroy, It is about executing Palestinian sociality and livability because the colonized get tired from unending trauma, and yes, we get tired. Targeting Palestinians like Shireen, the unending murderers, the arrest, the accumulation of years of carcerality. Let us start counting the years that Palestinians have spent in Israeli prison, or look at how many kids like Ahmed Manasra were in solitary confinement. Should I count those numbers of years? The souls, the children, the men, the women, the homes, the land, the spaces, the connectivities and love lost and stolen. The demolition of homes and psychic power is about the killing of Palestinian sociality and continuity. As my neighbor said, Hara'u anfasna, they burned our breath, yeah? And the evidence-based brutal science of killing and overkilling should be exposed. And as I see it, it provides the possibility for the settler colonial madness. But the result of this necrocapitalist policy is on display today. This is the display of the necrocapitalist regime. The message is that we must work to put a stop to this, because Shireen Abu Aqli said, even when she felt death is approaching, she kept on reporting. And the slogan that were heard today, when she was brought to Jerusalem, it was علي 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 الصوت اللي بيهتف ما بيموت. Raise, raise, raise your voice. Those who speak, who chant, who cry cannot die. So hope is our discipline. So let us speak live, raise our voices, collectivity, connectivity, togetherness against state killability, and make a life-making practice of solidarity. Life, action, speech, and hope are the practice of freedom against this necropolitical regime. Thank you.
Sure, thank you both so much. Yeah, that was really, really powerful, really moving. There's some really great responses in the chat, which I urge people to read, and also getting a lot of emails requesting these articles. So yeah, thank you so much. That was really powerful, really prescient to the moment we're living through it. Okay, so now moving on to Asad Ashim Sharma. Asad is the director of the 1987 press, and he's the author of Against the Frame, published by Barak in 2017, and also Broken Sleep Books in 2022. Ergastulum, also published by Broken Sleep Books, and the forthcoming Boiled Owls, which will be published by Nightboat Books next year. He's a Chase-funded PhD candidate in English and Humanities at Birkbeck College.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks to everyone, all the editors, the scholars whose contributions have opened many ways of thinking the world for me, and to all the members of this online audience. You are the largest audience I think I have ever read to as a humble poet, and so I'm incredibly nervous. I will try and speak as clearly as possible. I thought I would just introduce a little bit about the poems that I'm reading today, and maybe a bit about my context. So my context as an Indian South African or descendant of Indian South African anti-apartheid activists living in the UK. The UK is a place where poetry is often only considered as poetry when it passes fake affect behind the pursed lips of polite society. So to be with you here as a poet from what might be termed a contemporary avant-garde who's kept on the fringes of polite poetry culture is quite humbling and significant. I'm really grateful, basically, to be here. I'm not going to read today from the poems that were published in the issue, but rather from some new poems, which I've been working on in the 5th anniversary edition of my debut collection, Against the Frame. In that collection, I was really young, and I was thinking of and with Judith Butler's work on frames of war, and maybe it kind of uncannily came to me that maybe what I was thinking about was actually a critique of necrocapitalism. That original work was a response to the wars in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan from the perspective of a racialized subject living in the UK in the wake of the Brexit referendum. But the poems I'm reading today are from a new sequence under the same title. They explore responses to protests in solidarity with Palestine that happened in London in 2021, the censorship of cultural production, which is happening on a mass scale in the UK now, and the dominance of an idiolect of liberal identity politics that has defanged anti-racism and decolonization here in the UK. It hadn't occurred to me really that the frame I'm working against in these poems is a necrocapitalist frame in which the subject internalizes his, her, their right to death. It's a frame which asserts that what is valued as life is only, in a structural sense, white life. Against the frame. Tied against chewing, razor blue gums, salt in the wound, citizenry amassed, dividends, individuals, we were on the unshore of revocation privilege in mere continuance. The acts abolish you and I. Did you not see the warning signs? Did you feel asphyxiated in the conqueror's deluge? We arrived unabreasted of what they intended, cannot go back, marooned in land. How many testimonies will we need to hear before the truth can cry out, unlabored by the discourse of non-position? Who can speak for others? It rests on the rear-glanced treason. Here I am, your seditious anti-national. My entry is not an offering, and your palm is over my forehead, forcing words into the soft bruise of my voice, which I can no longer stomach. Ensconced in breathlessness, we moved in as opalescence, ignominious fortitude there, after autochthony immured us on the kelp. That territory takes fear into the ground, where I grasp what it is to be effaced by the recoiling hydra, where the gesture reverses and dispersal pulled back into the clench of a fist. Unheimlich radio, you follow me around with chalk as I laid down on a private road holding white calla lilies. Whiteness bites its thumb at me from Colosseum steps. The news that stayed news is reeled around, kettled vanguards. On any bridge in London, you were on the other side of the police wall with your camera held close to your eye, shooting me. They stomp loud I ams in defense of the dead. I am with them, raising a voice in tandem. The pen feels futile in my hand in the fall of anthems, of kumbayas. Peace means war for many of us who have to daily wage war against itself. I see Palestinians and British Jews arm in arm, hand in hand, eye to eye, trodden on by shifting frames. Their nuisance is censored, removed from society, ignored. Patiently waiting for you to grasp that race implies verbiage in the doing, that what really went down is not sentimentality, but verbing. I am raced. That is what the frame does to me. It does. On the verge of the verb, I lose recognition of myself, objectified by the sentience of the flesh suit. The frame bestows on me the gift of citizenship, the right to be sectioned. Doing words require systems of recognition for acts. Why does solidarity fall so silent under the telescope of securitization? You feel safe behind the page and its anonymity. I don't feel safe because my skin's made to extend to its cover. Writers promote each other's work as brave, but my poems are not brave because I don't want to push myself in that way sufficiently or write down my grandmother's recipes. And if you use diaspora to speak of me as a minority, when I look to the world and see more resemblance than you, I wonder what comes of the social in this bureaucracy where I'm expected to commodify myself to speak around race. And there isn't anything roundabout being raced. You place me in a quadrant and file reports on my sales. heard the call of the ancestors in the drum tap, echoed out of its blue note into foreclosed shop objects. Take the horizon and ascertain a position. Become the narrator in Jane Eyre. Maths did a violence to me, turned me to a statistic. It didn't represent the conditions or my context. What does it mean to make a number from a person if not to make a cartoon of a body? There might as well be nothing outside of theory. It's the only thing that kept me going in the tough mudder of broken economic faculties. Institutions, colonial or otherwise, crumble like a croissant, and the idea that ash is fertile for rebirth seems febrile in this landscaped garden. Offline and out there, I know a forest has many stems. To defy logic and reason that left the room I entered. Liberation has no theology. I left Allah in the mosque when I went to the protest. I gave no takbirs for Sheikh Jarrah. I let Palestinian women teach me the dabka. A prominent South Asian artist asks me when I last prayed Salah. It makes no sense. I know that the space where the law acts is always exceptional, that what the law offers is the monolith, the Manichaean, the logic of license. Tell me, we already live in the multiverse when potential isn't kept by the terms which jurisprudence might lay upon, or how the myth of origin bruises my O-bone with its lashes. I want to be a scarab beetle on the Leviathan, looking down to the earth with yearning. Diversification compressed me into fungible tokens. How much milk from the moose can be drawn? No one knows, but it's always worth the gamble. Can't predict the end of whiteness. It's secateurs. Frame could mean square, could be anything that turns subject to object, that takes out my canines, sets dogs on me in a garden where I'm not allowed to walk on the grass, where we're not allowed to walk on the grass together. The descent is slow to fascism, but quickens with apathy and lack thereof of dissent, of thought, to flow unobstructed by nostalgia and its pathetic war on the future. If, like offshored souls gathered into secure containers, the envelope of dim light trotting over here and over there, doesn't it feel just envious of the spirit on a picket line, speakerphonic, megasonic? I want to shout at you and your likeness framed in liquid crystal. This is a manifesto for hope. The move tout monde has been stalled in a backyard by a place where food is handed out as credit, that what financial violence entails in a debt we can't be forgiven for, in a world in trillions of microcurrencies. I'm not one for having to delimit the land backs might stroke forth into a new curvature. Could it not be possible again? Could it not be made possible again? To begin the day as each one was fresh. After a storm, I'll pick up the litter on the road. After all, isn't that what the day after revolution has become? What is public here is euphemism for loot. Surely it makes sense, and there is an account for that in the city. The defense might say, innocent until proven guilty, but guilt is lack, and lack is wealth's precurse. Riot shields around an oxbow lake, it dared to stand apart and dwell with water's collection. Viscounts of doom reporting on a terrific reel of uncommonality, the aesthesiological milieu of rhizomatic mangoes, universal machinations of to just be nice to everyone. I want to tell you that it isn't necessary for you to write a book on it. The mood is in the air, as palpable as bad breath. I believe all of us have to come out of the other side of identity politics. That is what the road to freedom requires. But I won't apologize for pointing to the ground's uneven surface, like how your gait is a tide, how I want mine like a four-wheel left-hand drive, To get there, we need to let go of the idea that selling poetry as a cultural commodity is full of feeling. You want to incorporate me into what exactly? Assimilation, toleration, the gelatinous, moribund, locomotive narcissism of belonging. It is sticky and disgusting. Ain't no tribe, no ethnicity, no custom that could classify me. I'm not with solemn reflection. Just what I saw at the river's edge was sly civility or shy mimicry, liminal perversions of potentia that I couldn't hold in any more than I kept you out now. But to rest, or to say it rests on a long song carried in the imagination, a flight from, a fright of. Sovereignty is not the savior, and no complex of needing to be saved is relevant here. How the dates line up in a binary, a contraction of the march into a standstill. Our rebellion was a guided tour of a park in the city. And I stood on any bench, looked up in the rain. It was clear as any day. You know, every time there's like violence when it relates to wars that are happening or might be happening on the fringes of Europe, everyone on poetry Twitter or like social media for literature share this one poem by Ilya Kaminsky, and I really hate that poem. So this is about that. The hounds of blood snap at my elbows, gurgling and salivating, edging out. We lived happily during the war. Good for you to acknowledge that. I'm really pleased you survived and you bore witness. It has made a world of difference to my decimated articulation. I'm not just a colored writing about race, and I wish these could be the last words I inscribe on the matter, but my hands grip the jagged desk and I speak into the camera on yet another panel. My coffee is orange in the sunset and there isn't a red wheelbarrow visible outside. In the late winter's first blue sky, you approached me with the cruelty of good humor. That is how it seems. For how can a smile or a dimpled cheek not remind of loss? Rhetoric makes of language a tool to rouse or to manipulate, and poems flush in the house, haunting the huddled together with dandyish promises and Victorian values, steadfast with work ethics. What was the best part of your week, you ask? What is the best part of any week? Made of feudal serfdom of all that constitutes pleasure, all that made life a possibility, a privilege, now trapped in the tomorrow that comes like a bell tolling for a crowd, but it clangs out the code we walk on, treading daffodils in dread by Windmill Row, on Lower Marsh, wilting flowers, the romance conjured only when every breath breaks the law. I belched out slogans at a demonstration. The police drown them out with sirens. Those who resist are arrested. Those who resist are ignored by their elected representatives. Demands are met only partially or not at all. Invasions and violations happen daily, privately, behind the veil of digitality. First, they will come for your right to protest. Then they come for your papers. Then they come for your body. His prolixity merged with hyper-subtle undoings of world systems, the theory that I could be in any cafe listening to the report, asking me to choose a side like a child. I want to be affirmative in sabotage of this whimsy that replaces the long movement of dialectics, seeing how the past carries over the letter. Identity is a neurosis and imprisons the I in me, terrorizes what might seem like a heartbeat, loud in the inner ears, feels pathological, as if to have focus on the breath is itself a marker of illness. A scrambled synapse, the inability to have the body do what it should be doing in the background. The frame domesticates politics, where trauma is as ubiquitous as carbon, a year-long Olympics. And you came to me projecting difficulty onto me, kept me away from the future you swaddle. I need you to know everything is already difficult. but we can access it as easy as paper cuts, dwell on softened sheets in search of form, or form's long song, which embraces me like fiber. Optics for self-exoticized commodities, thinking of growth as a utopia of resistance, like a scout's badge on a long-sleeved shirt. How many times will I have to put up signs? I'm working here. Sometimes we just be talking, and that's okay to love. Reckless soticea made together as sound from the beginning. More time we lose directness of the image in the rush to get it out to page people. Bring me to the Brinjari, to turn metal back to mineral, and let attunement lead with grass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azad. That was, I think, a really fittingly moving way to close out the invited presentations. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So many of the lines sort of, I think, lodge themselves in the head for a while. We're now going to move on to Garth Stevens, who is going to discuss the different presentations he's heard here today. Garth is a professor and clinical psychologist in the Department of Psychology in the School of Human and Community Development at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. His research interests include foci on race, racism and related social asymmetries, racism and knowledge production, critical psychology, ideology, power and discourse, violence and its prevention, historical and collective trauma and memory, applied psychoanalytic theorizing of contemporary social issues, and masculinity, gender, and violence. He's published widely in these areas, and he's a member of the Academy of Sciences South Africa. He serves as the Dean in the Faculty of Humanities at WITS, and he's the past president of PsySSA.
Thank you very much, Nick. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So, Azad, that's a really, really hard act to follow. It was extremely powerful and moving, and so I'm going to try my best in the time that I have to say something meaningful about what's really been some great contributions. So let me begin by just saying thank you to Shanaz, to Nick, for the introductions, to PsySSA and the UNISA Institute for Social and Health Sciences for hosting this event and for inviting me to participate. And of course, to all of you who've been involved in this really wonderful special issue. For those of you who know Nick, you'll know that anything that speaks about a critique of capital is on Nick's radar at any point. So Nick, I'm thrilled that you're chairing and having this intellectual and political interest stimulated. To Lara, Zoe, Nadira, Stephanie, and Azad, it's wonderful to be able to reflect on your inputs today. Some of you as long-standing comrades and others who I'm just getting to know and whose work I'm really getting to know. This is a difficult task. It's difficult because of just the broad sweep and range of what it is that's been discussed today, and in the special issue itself, but also because of the context in which we're speaking. And I think Nadira has done a really, really great job in sketching that very, very difficult context in Palestine in particular. And I know I'm not going to do justice to it, but let me try to make some cogent remarks. It was really fantastic to read your works alongside each other on the concept of necrocapitalism and psychic violence, really as a kind of compendium of cutting-edge ideas about the vexing nature of capitalism, violence, and death, and their integral relationships in so many spheres of social life. And I really would encourage all of you to go out and read the full special issue that this webinar is based on. So when Lara was speaking and framing the talk this evening, I was reminded of the work by Foucault, of course, on biopolitics and the regulation of biological life of our species through various technologies, political and others. Sometimes in its most mundane forms, our current self-monitoring of our health through our smart devices, but more invasively through processes like birth control and its effects on sexual and reproductive health, to, of course, more pernicious events such as torture, in which there's the competing biopolitical threat to kill a detainee on the one hand, and yet the imperative to save the detainee's life through nasal tube feeding when they elect to die through a hunger strike, for example. This idea of biopolitics was, of course, extended on by Mbembe and really in the terrain of necropolitics, also transcending Giorgio Agamben's idea of bare life by suggesting that contemporary social formations rely on large swaths of the population living precariously, being designated as the living dead, if you will, and always existing in the borderlands between life and death. A contemporary politics in which some of us live lives because others are always existing under the real or imagined inevitability, possibility, or threat of death. Now, of course, necrocapitalism extends even further on this when it speaks back to the manner in which modern modes of accumulation are foundationally premised upon trading in death or the threat of death. The archival looting, for example, that Zoe speaks about, or the secret assemblages and the military-industrial complex that Nadia and Stephanie have spoken about. But of course, we all also know about the import of the fourth estate or the media and the spectacular displays of violence and war that become modes of commodified entertainment. We've seen extreme forms of poverty and exploitation, dispossession, trading in bodily organs, and of course, the list goes on and on when one thinks about what necrocapitalism really looks like in the day-to-day of our lives. And so I'm raising this because I think it's important that we don't think about necrocapitalism as something abstracted, but something very, very real and materially located in our lives each and every day. And I think that Lara's framing certainly does some of that. The second component, of course, which is really important, is the idea of a psychic intrusion. And that is the normalization of death as foundational to accumulation and excess life for some, while others remain precarious. And of course, in these death salient conditions, I think that one finds two modes of operating simultaneously. The one is often a silence about the nature of this precarity, and the other is an overt form of impunity that is exercised by others. And elsewhere, I've spoken about this interlocking relationship between silence and impunity that I think is part of our contemporary social, political, and psychological malaise in some ways. Of course, what I'm alluding to is an interest in how dominant ideologies become activated and integrated into the psychic apparatus itself, giving rise to docile citizens or bystanders in some instances, as well as how impunity becomes exercised as a form of desirous excess and entitlement on the other end. In both instances, I suppose what I'm suggesting is that these interlocking features are underpinned by a withdrawing response on the one hand when one thinks about silence, and a compensatory response to annihilation anxiety on the other hand. This kind of annihilation anxiety, of course, is, I'm not going to go into the details of this. Of course, people like Freud spoke about it, Beyond spoke about it, Winnicott spoke about it, Lyons spoke about it. Most importantly for me, Fanon spoke about it in his work around alienation and annihilation of bodies and psychic sequestration. So while silence is a withdrawal and avoidance mechanism that creates the fantasy of personal exemption and safety and disentangles one from the possibility of this kind of annihilation anxiety, impunity operates on the other end of the scale as a kind of false sense of mastery and compensation in the direction of jouissance, of excess in some ways. It conceals lack. And the reason why I'm raising this is because silence and docility seem more precarious a response. But in fact, we must recognize that the current forms of necrocapitalism are extremely fragile themselves because they require constant shoring up all of the time through overt acts of impunity. In fact, the very rampant nature of acts of impunity reveal the systemic fragility of necrocapitalism itself. And I think certainly when Lara was talking, she was already alluding to some of the modes of resistance that, of course, Zoe and Nadira and Stephanie speak to later on in their papers. Zoe, thanks for your paper on archival lootings and the afterlife of genocide. It really speaks to the ways in which sustained forms of exploitation based on genocide occur long after the temporal moment of the event itself. And of course, psychic intrusions here are accompanied at the material level by the kind of commodification and the thingification of bodies and remains on the one hand. They are also accompanied by a refusal to acknowledge genocide in the constant making of the other, the raised other as less than human, as subhuman, or as non-human, to use terms by Alexander Weylie in his book called Habeas Viscus, when he describes the kind of contemporary racializing assemblages that occur in the world today. And of course, it's also accompanied by sovereign intrusions into the collective memory and consciousness of another state to compromise the very memory retrieval and the democratization of multiple histories. Of course, we see these kinds of critiques in repatriation movements across the world today, and they point to this level of psychic intrusion and the ways in which archives are continuously appropriated in the service of certain hegemonies, historical and contemporary, by both colonizers and, as Zoe's correctly pointed out, by those who sometimes claim the place of post-colonial victors. In South Africa, of course, one of the most notable lootings and repatriations was, of course, of Sarah Baartman, who died in 1815, in December of 1815. But her remains were taken off to Paris. Her brain, a skeleton, her sexual organs remained on display in a Paris museum until the 1970s. And they were in fact only repatriated almost 200 years later in 2002, known as the Hottentot Venus. Of course, you know, this was really the epitome of the exoticism associated with Black raced bodies, the commodification of Black people, and the kinds of colonial exploitation and racism associated with those bodies. What stood out for me, Zoe, in your paper was really this move towards what I believe you've referred to as a kind of radical redistribution of the global archive. And for me, this is really, really central to the decolonial project. Archives are central to the decolonial project, because I think we all know that in the contemporary world, there's been a willful or neglectful destruction of archives today. In other instances, an offloading and an unbundling of those archives when they've been corporatized. And archives are critical to the generation of histories and the retrieval of multiple histories that are contested, living, dynamic, and that are imperative to counter the kind of cultural decimation and genocide as part of a broader decolonial project. So thank you for raising some of these key anchor points for us, Zoe. Nadira, Stephanie, you know, your paper on secrecy assemblages, I think is fascinating and is similar to, I suppose, what one sees in many other authoritarian regimes, not only today, but in our history, but also, I think importantly for us to remember, present in so-called post-authoritarian regimes as well. These are not only features of authoritarian regimes, but are much more widespread than this. And Nadira, thank you for making the moving connection to Shireen's death in Palestine. I mean, I think it's important that this be located in the kind of material realities of the contemporary moment. So thank you for that. It seems to me that when we're talking about secrecy and the way that you're talking about secrecy, we really are talking about it operating at two levels. At the one level, there's the sovereign, and at another, in some ways, a kind of panopticon of sorts. The power of the sovereign to know and to act, to kill, is always present, but there's also simultaneously a kind of self-disciplining of the subject that becomes docile under the constant threat of the secret, when alive and even when we are dead. As you've already illustrated in the treatment of Shireen's body after her death. The role of secrecy as a political and surveillance technology, of course, you've also illustrated as being deeply connected to the complex military-industrial complex itself. Yeah? And I think, again, you know, this is an important dimension because, of course, there's an affective dimension to this. There's a way in which subjects are regulated, but there's also a much more, there's a much bigger connection to modes of accumulation here that I think is part of the kind of necrocapitalism that we're talking about. I think you've eloquently, you know, articulated the way that secrecy starts to impact affective states that arise and the way that psychic space becomes colonized. In some ways, you know, the colonization of psychic space occurs at three levels. The first is that you deny that psychic space exists at all. Because, of course, if you aren't considered human, you certainly can't have a psychic space. If you have to concede psychic space, you try to sequester that psychic space. And if you can't sequester that psychic space, you control that psychic space. This is all in the service of a process of accumulation that I think you've all illustrated very eruditely. But here's the important thing, and I've had this conversation with Nadira in another context, of course. Secrecy flourishes as a political technology, ironically, when it is not fully secret. In other words, you have to let others know that you have secret information in order for it to be a useful political technology. And this is why we are told that they always have secret information about us. But therein lies its precise Achilles heel. Secrecy and its unveiling more and more reduces its purchase power over the psyche, as it reduces the fantastical elements of the very lie of the omnipotence that sits beneath it in the first place. Judith Herman, in a different text, as a writer on trauma and so on, she was writing on political theory, and I'm going to kind of, probably brutalize her quote a little bit, but she talks about how in order to escape accountability for crimes, perpetrators often do everything in their power to promote a kind of forgetting. And secrecy and silence are the perpetrator's first line of defense here. If secrecy fails, the perpetrator attacks the credibility of the victim. If they cannot silence the victim, they make sure that no one listens. And this is why exposing, telling, retelling, and archiving of secrecy and secrets are so important to diminish the kind of colonization of psychic space as an act of violence itself. So thank you to both of you for raising all of this. Azad, thank you for your, again, all I can say, erudite, powerful, moving. I'm afraid that I'm going to do a deep injustice if I try to make any kind of commentary on what it is that you've said. But what did strike me was the kind of work that you were referencing, and that is a question about what makes a life grievable. It's the kind of Butlerian, Judith Butler's work on what makes a life grievable at any given point in time. And that life only really becomes grievable if it is a life that is recognized in and of itself as a life worth living. And it is only worth mourning when it is lost if it is recognized as a life itself. And this differential value that we attribute to life, premised on race, gender, religion, class, nationality, must be resisted if we are to develop a shared model community that values our shared community. What struck me also about what it is that you did this evening was that I think you are illustrating that this notion of a differentiation between the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences, this distinction, is an artificial one. What you've really enacted for us tonight is what Kenneth Gergen has spoken about as a performative social science. It allows us to think of different modes of analysis and resistance. It collapses thinking as we traditionally think of it, but it speaks to us through the viscerality of the arts, something that the traditional mode of textual production is perhaps unable to do at times, and again highlights the importance of polyvocal distributional regimes of knowledge and understanding of context of oppression. So I want to end off by just saying to all our participants this evening, I really hope that you take the opportunity to think about some of what's been shared this evening, to link it to your own context, wherever that may be, to consider how these and other forms of necrocapitalism continue to play themselves out in very real, material, and overt ways, but also in very insidious and quotidian ways. Thank you again to all of you for the stimulating insights, despite the challenging and deeply moving nature of the content that you've all shared with us today. Nick, I think I'm going to stop there. I think I'm at about 15 minutes, so let me hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Garth, for that wide-ranging theoretical tour de force that we can always expect of you, and for engaging not only the presentations, but also the sort of longer pieces in the special issue, just so beautifully and so succinctly. Yeah, and I sort of especially like that you sort of drew attention to spaces for resistance, and that no system is foreclosed. There's always fissures and ruptures that can be seized upon. So I'm not sure if any of the authors want to respond to Garth. There is a question that's been asked in the Q&A. but maybe first, if anyone wants to respond to Garth, and then maybe we can close up with a couple of questions. Or I can actually, this question it's quite wide ranging and long. So let me just open it up and throw it to people. It's an anonymous person posted it. It says, we talk now for months on this matter around Palestine. How do you see the resolve for the Palestinian crisis? What is the role of Hamas to resolve this matter? What is the role of Israel in the resolve? There's no doubt that the war machine stimulates economies. Military manufacturers have benefited and have grown massively since the Ukrainian invasion. Where do you put the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in this discussion? So it's an enormous question, but I think it's maybe just to stimulate some answers in addition to responding to Garth.
I mean, obviously they're very different contexts, and I wouldn't want to talk on behalf of or in place of any of our Palestinian speakers on how they see Palestinian liberation. But I can say that the ways in which Palestinian cultural production is blossoming in diaspora and at home, and I'm thinking particularly of writers like Surana Abu Akr, of Mira Mata in the UK, and how they're educating us on how to speak about Palestine, how to think with Palestinians about liberation is really incredible. And I'd encourage people to go and check out their work. The thing about Ukraine is I think this goes back to what Garth kind of said about in response to my poems is, when is life grievable? We are in the UK, this is, I can only speak from the context I'm in, we are deporting any asylum seeking or refugee who comes through what's designated as an illegal people trafficking route across the channel. We are going to send them to Rwanda, but at the same time, we are opening our borders unequivocally to Ukrainian refugees, as we should, right? I remember we should open the border completely. But this weighing up of one life over another is disgraceful. I mean, where is the humanitarianism in that, But this just gestures, I think, so explicitly to that, life is not equal in this world at the moment, and that's what we're reckoning with.
Yeah, let me take it from Azad's ending point is life is not equal, people are not equal, and take it one step further. This whole complex mode of functioning is a mode of accumulation, is a process, is an assemblage that is strengthening, rebuilding the omnipotence of empire, of the globe, of coloniality, and then asking a question requires that we really divorce from hegemonic framings, because that hegemonic framing is what is affecting our sight. We're not seeing, we're not hearing, we're seeing what they want us to see, we're hearing what they want us to hear. But what is being said is shooting started long time ago. Dispossession of land started long time ago. Global political engagement with this settler colonial regime in Palestine, the silencing of Palestinians started long time ago. What you see here is resistance to it. You see it in children throwing a stone to say, I refuse to accept humiliation as part of my daily life. We see it in mothers investing in their kids because their future is important. We see it in doctors fighting to get a dead body in a proper place in hospital and not frozen in Israeli freezers and not returned to their families, as in the case of the lack of release of our martyrs. There is a voice even of those that are in the freezers screaming, stop the settler coloniality. So let's ask a different question. Let them stop. let them حلوا عننا, like leave us alone. Seriously, like let us live. It's not about denying the existence of others. It's about please see the power, the agonies, and resistance. My 3-year-old granddaughter was upset at me that I left her, refused to respond to my phone because I left her, and she kept on saying no. So you expect a child who's seeing rifles and military demolishing saying yes to the Israeli occupation? No, they will say they will resist, they will continue to resist. So don't ask me about Hamas. Ask me what Israel is doing and let them stop it, because that is affecting psychic, spaces, familiarity, sociality, dismemberment, constant dismemberment. And what you see among Palestinians is, again, this building of life, of love, of continuity amidst death. What goes on here is a space, it's Hayyiz Imata is a space of death and dying, of killability. So let us ask the right question, and it has its effect on the psychic, of course.
I thank you so much, Nadira. And Damon, you say right, you speak right to the heart of it, right? I do want to sort of bring focus to, when we're talking about necrocapitalism and psychic violence, we're also talking about the seamlessness in which it sort of invades the spaces, invades our language, invades the structures, even the way we think about things, even the way we might structure a question. And I think that is how you are talking about, because in the question about Hamas or about Ukraine, right? What that's doing against the backdrop of a necrocapitalist violence of a settler colonial regime is legitimizing one way of thinking about things and deflecting from the settler colonial logics that create the condition to begin with, right? And that's what we're saying. And this is the way in which it pervades consciously and unconsciously, even spaces when we're intending to create a sort of organization. I'm thinking about Zoe's point about epistemological reorganization. These questions have the opposite effect of that. They reorganize the way we might, what are we attending to and what are we not attending to? So in asking that question, it's not a denial of what's happening in Ukraine, but it is a denial of what's happening in Palestine. No one's disimagining the dead of Ukraine. No one's disimagining the suffering that's happening, but what is happening is a disimagining even of the dead in Palestine. That is how Shireen can just die, right? Not be killed, not be assassinated, but just die. And I think that's the point that we're sort of talking about. It's on us when we talk about, well, what is to be done? It's on us to refuse that disimagining in the past, in the present, and in the future. And I think this is what this special issue does, is how do we continuously speak back? How do we breathe life into the things that are, and the people and the spaces and the homes that are disimagined, even by colloquial everyday questions that to us seem normalized, but have actually been regularized by oppression and structures of necrocapitalist violence.
Thank you so much, Lara. I don't know if there's any other last points. There was another question asked here in the chat, and we are going to have to close out quite soon. But let me read it. It says, what do you think are the critical factors for the construction of spaces that are safe from psychic intrusions and necrocapitalist violence? So what are the critical factors for construction of spaces that are safe from these things?
I can speak about culture as a space if you want. I mean, I'm a publisher as well as a poet. I'm also a student, so I kind of look to the university still as a kind of a place where maybe that happens, right? Like the university should still be a safe space. However, what I think we're seeing increasingly is this whole nonsense of the culture war is actually a war on culture. And what it means is that the war on culture does not want dissent, because dissent does come from cultural producers. The war on culture denies and disavows everything we have learned from Stuart Hall et al. In the field of cultural study, that culture is a dynamic space. Culture is a fluid space. It is a creolized space. And we should feel very proud that that is what culture is historically, whether it's in diaspora or whether it's, you know, situated on the left and engaging with multiple strands of epistemology and thinking. But now what we're having is the resurgence of monocultural nationalisms all around the world, and it is destroying cultural space. As an Indian, I feel so heartbroken to see the death of syncretism that is happening there with the resurgence of you know, Hindu far-right thought, which is just obliterating some of the most beautiful cultural expressions that we've had in the world. I mean, the Ismaili Institute have done this amazing book in the past called Crossing the Threshold here. I urge you to watch the documentary on that to see how we've lived side by side for centuries. And this is true in urban areas, it's true in much of the world. What we are seeing is the world is once again being bifurcated, not along a color line. I think it's strict, it's a racialized economic line. And this is where the culture war really is. It's a war on all of our cultural expressions, because unless you toe the line by you know, essentially fitting into a necrocapitalist frame or the frame of kind of global capitalism, you will have your funding pulled, you will be censored. The viciousness of this form of violence that we're experiencing, this coalescence, is truly going to be the end of, you know, one of the most beautiful things about humanity, which is all of our cultures and our literatures, etc., etc.
This might, if I could share something. I mean, I think that this might be a bit controversial, but I think if we're thinking about the construction of spaces that are safe from these kinds of intrusions, I think that gatekeeping is actually very important. I think, especially in looking at the United States and looking at what has been allowed through free speech, how the right has been very open about how free speech was just a Trojan horse to allow for fascistic and white nationalists and all of these other ethno-national ideas into the public sphere. I think that we actually have to reject this liberal falsehood of universality, this liberal idea, this absolutist idea that every politic is welcome and legitimate and a valuable part of the formation of these anti-colonial liberatory politics, because they aren't. And this idea of you know, say what, I don't agree with you, but I'll defend your right to say it. I don't defend your right to say and support things that actively contribute to my annihilation and the annihilation of other marginalized, targeted communities, both here and around the world. That doesn't make any sense. And I think that's incredibly counterproductive for the kind of coalitions that we seek to build. So I don't mean gatekeeping in terms of like, we won't speak to white people, we won't do this, but I do think that it is warranted to be incredibly discerning, and especially now, of the kinds of bonds that we make with one another, of the kinds of politics that we decide to disavow or not speak loudly enough because it is politically inconvenient. And to be really real and be really careful and really honest and take a lot of chances. And it is risky and it is dangerous, but I think that, as Nadira and Azad and everyone has shared, I think that the stakes are big, right? The stakes are literally life. And I think that we need to just open ranks to any and everything, because life is so valuable. It is.
Yeah, it's thank you, Zoe. It's so true. But it's also, it reminds me that we need really to remember that it is in the very big political things that we need to really stand up, but it's also with attentiveness to the very small actions of that construct safety, that are not seen in music and in culture and in poetry and in togetherness and in understanding. And when faced with that, you know, gigantic question that I always hear. Well, do you believe in coexistence? You know, that question. And I really need to come back and say, you know, don't you think that first you need to exist in order to coexist? You cannot keep on smashing and destroying and invading and penetrating every single aspect of the visceral and then tell me, well, let's go coexist. So stop that here, decolonize. So to do that, we really, really need to be very, very attentive to the minute act of love, of care. And sometimes I do ask myself, are we really, in Arabic, there's this concept, minnaza, yani, are we really dying and we're just bullshitting ourselves? It's not about survival, but rather, or livability, but dying. But listen, just come to the old city and walk with me. You'll see life. You'll see life in every single action of every shop owner, of every young and old, of every school kid. So we need to construct spaces of safe spaces, but the question is, how do we deal? And the very intimate is very political, and the very political really affects the visceral. So we need to remember that it's very complicated.
It's your call, Nadira, is a call, and Nick, I'll hand it over to you, but it's a call, and I hope that this was the sort of hope that I had for this special issue, and it went beyond what I could have ever imagined. Is that it is really on us to create those solidarity barricades, like you're saying, Zoe, right? That they're revolutionary barricades that we can really fend off. Like, fascism is upon us. It is not on the precipice. It's upon us globally. I think that's what Azad was saying. And to come together in that, in unbending solidarity, right? And that does mean to do things like we're doing today, to think about who we invite into our spaces, to think about who we uplift, to think about the politics of citation, to think about the politics of what academia looks like, who writes, who narrates, who has the right to do these things. Because the inverse of what Zoe was talking about is that is another example of a psychic intrusion, because who is tasked with having expansiveness and capaciousness for dialogue is not distributed equally. It is always those of us who are at the end of a barrel that are asked to then extend and expand our egos just that much more, right? And so what I would say as a space of safety against psychic intrusion is to lean into refusal and lean into collective refusal together, to stand by Nadira, to stand by Palestinians and say, no, we will not let people ask to give even an inch more, right? And that refusal to not be moralized in a way to say, there's always a way for us to psychically defang and depoliticize refusal. And instead to say, let's actually fortify this refusal altogether and strengthen those barricades and strengthen the ways in which people can infiltrate, right, to cause further psychic intrusion. So back to what Garth was saying is, the fragility of necrocapitalism is the same fragility as settler colonialism. Wherever there's space, it will try and intrude. And that is why the fortification of our psychic defenses are actually really helpful. They're not pathological. They're exactly what we need to fight off the intrusions and the suffocation and the death.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lara, and everyone. This webinar, like the special issue, just soared above my already very high expectations. It's just utterly electrifying tonight. Thank you so much to everyone. And thank you also to Mohammed and Fatima from the PsySSA office for organizing this, the sort of smoothness and way that all the questions and everything is handled is entirely up to them. Yeah, thank you to all the speakers, and also to Shanaz, Garth as the discussant. This was really powerful, and I think that's evidenced in the very high numbers that stayed here right till the end. And yes, thank you also everyone, speakers, audience included, for spending so long with us this evening. This was for me, and I think everyone here, 2 hours really, really well spent. I feel just excited, heartbroken, and yeah, this was really, really stimulating and provocative, prescient. So thank you so much to everyone. Yeah, I think we can close it there. Have a good evening or morning, wherever you are in the world. Stay safe. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody.